Okay, so we have begun the recording. Welcome, everyone. It's nice to see your faces again. And we have made it to chapter 10 of this enormous book, where I think it's really the climax of the book, where these various strains that they've been working through, they bring them all together to issue what I think is a theoretically, archaeologically, and historically rich and devastating critique of these a priori assumptions about civilization and states being one and the same. And so this chapter, I think, really sums up all of the work that they've been developing so far, and where they really reach a conclusion about these three different strains, these three elementary forms of domination, which are, let me put them in the text: sovereignty, administration, and charismatic competition. And so what the authors end up arguing, trouble with the windows here, one second. Okay, so sovereignty, administration, and charismatic competition, they argue, are the three elementary forms of domination, and that the three of them ultimately have separate historical roots, and therefore any effort to talk about these three elements being the characteristics of civilization are misplaced, because really what they more accurately are three separate strains of domination that, when taken together, will form both the format for ancient states and for modern states. And so they end up arguing, and this is from page 431 in the US version of the book, that what we now regard as states turn out not to be a constant of history at all, not the result of a long evolutionary process that began in the Bronze Age, but rather a confluence of three political forms: sovereignty, administration, and charismatic competition, that have different origins. Modern states are simply one way in which the three principles of domination happen to come together, but this time with a notion that the power of kings is held by an entity called the people or the nation, and that bureaucracies exist for the benefit of said people, and in which a variation of old aristocratic contests and prizes has come to be relabeled as democracy, most often in the form of national elections. None of this was inevitable, but what they do indicate is that over time, there will often be aristocracies that form. And so Simona's mentioned this before, that aristocracies tend to be the most common forms of government, but they're not the only form of government. But what I find so useful in their approach is showing that even in the realm of national elections that have the pretense of being democratic, that really these are founded on the roots of aristocratic traditions and charismatic competitive politics, and that this is merely one arena in which a game involving charismatic politics plays out, but that itself is not the origin of the modern state. But when it forms alongside a bureaucracy and sovereignty, that those three can join together to form what we have today, the modern state. So I want to put in here a quote that just find it. actually, I'll paste it. This is from the English version of on page 430 over to 431. Okay, sociologist Philip Abrams pointed out long ago, this was in an article in 1977 that appeared in the journal, actually the first volume and first number of the Journal of Historical Sociology, that, quote, the state is not the reality that which stands behind the mask of political practice. It is itself the mask which prevents our seeing political practice as it is. And then the authors continue to understand the latter. We must attend to the senses in which the state does not exist rather than to those in which it does. And I think this really, in a nutshell, exemplifies the kind of speculative epistemology that they use so effectively in this book, that if we are to understand what states are, then we've got to start with first principles that look at how states are themselves the practice and not the product of states. And so it helps remove the kind of teleology or telos that seems to be at the core of histories that end up serving to reinforce ideologies of aristocracy and domination, because the assumption will be that societies follow a very similar path of social evolution. And then finally, what the authors are able to argue by using the example of Minoan artists in Crete, who are something of a historical outlier, but in this speculative epistemology, historical outliers that cannot otherwise be explained, suggest the limits of conventional epistemologies. And so they end up suggesting that what until now has passed for civilization might in fact be nothing more than a gendered appropriation by men etching their claims in stone of some earlier system of knowledge that had women at its center. And this is on page 433. What the authors are ultimately concluding there is that the sorts of systems of knowledge that existed, when they've become appropriated over time, these intimate relations of care can become relations of domination. And most of the historical examples are of instances where men are dominating women, and yet in the example of an outlier like Minoan Crete, there are examples, there's art that can't otherwise be explained. And so the one possible conclusion of this is that through the process of schismogenesis, that the primitive matriarchy, this term that was introduced early on in the book, may actually be accurate and may represent ways of being that were slowly appropriated by men in this process of state formation, but that there's nothing necessarily inevitable about it. And so the argument in this chapter doesn't, at least I don't find that it engages directly with the work of Camilla Power. And I know that she wrote a review early on of the book that said they didn't really put, in her view, gender forefront enough in their analysis. But I find that this really, the conclusion of the book, is basically making the suggestion that one of the ways that men have been able to appropriate have been able to appropriate and accumulate power for themselves is by appropriating wisdom that they've taken from women, and then imposing structures of violence on top of those patterns. So the argument seems to be that the modern state relies on these appropriations of women's labor, as well as connecting those forms of domination to ways of understanding property that is rooted in the land. And so there is the notion that land itself is property, which means that the administrative system in place is one where people have a relationship to property that excludes everyone else's relationship to property. So it's not really a relationship to the land as much as it is a relationship to other people, whereby people in control of the land can exclude those who might have competing claims to it. And then the same with the appropriation of women's knowledge, that this is an appropriation that can happen at the most intimate of levels, which makes it so insidious. And so when you combine these appropriations with property appropriations, you have the beginnings of what can be this system that allows for people to work toward the production of things that they set aside rather than merely the production of people themselves. However, this was never inevitable. And that's really, I think, the way that they end the book is by reminding people that these outliers really matter. And that if we assume culture to be creative refusal, then this is really where we have to start, by looking in the areas where people refused modern states or even ancient states, or the elementary forms of domination associated with the rise of states, to even take shape. And so this chapter to me is really a book unto itself. It's almost like where they take the method that they've developed over the previous 9 chapters and they sum it all up in like 90 pages, where they say, and here's how we can connect the state formations that we understand to be ancient, and how that process can be misunderstood in a way to conflate it with more modern state formations, where people are they're mixing and matching these different understandings of state, where really it ends up just state is basically a kind of oppression, which ends up not having very much analytical power, because if we end up trying to find the roots of the British parliamentary system in the Inca IU, then that's exactly what we're going to find, because that's what we're teleologically setting out to look for. So the one beautiful line toward the end of the text is, and I'm going to drop this in the chat because I just love how it ends. And this is from, I believe, 433. And that is where we once assumed civilization and state to be conjoined entities that came down to us as a historical package, take it or leave it forever. What history now demonstrates is that these terms actually refer to complex amalgams of elements which have entirely different origins and which are currently in the process of drifting apart. And they use the example of the World Trade Organization, the IMF, et cetera, multinational corporations. And then they end, seen this way, to rethink the basic premises of social evolution is to rethink the very idea of politics itself. And what I love about this last sentence is because they're starting from a first principles theory of social action, every human action is inherently political, even though they're working from an ontology that is quite level or flat. And so it to me, it reconciles a lot of the problems that have been inherent in some of the post-structuralist work, where they do confuse ontology with epistemologies. And what I like about this is that they're basically keeping their ideas of nature non-dualistic, which means they're keeping them kind of fluid and flexible, while constructing an epistemology that is speculative in nature. And so it wears up front, or presents up front, the very limitations of its own reasoning. And that, to me, I find much more useful than epistemologies that actually purport to be much more scientifically rigorous, because they will often transpose their ontological assumptions into the epistemologies that they're constructing, where they're not really questioning. So in this case, if you're looking at a society, you're basically looking at the individual as if the individual can behave in a way on nature that allows them to be outside of nature. And what they're arguing ultimately, and why for me it's such a satisfying conclusion, is they are arguing that they, social scientists, are as much of this project of state formation, and that the only way to do really rigorous science is to be firmly aware of those trappings from the start, which is why this book, after 700 pages, ends up being not a conclusive or definitive statement about the past, but actually just a call to action to start writing the histories that privilege mutual aid and creative refusal as the dynamic of social reproduction, rather than looking at all of the products of state formation. So they end up delivering on their promise, but their promise is really just an opening that calls upon us to do the kind of work that historians haven't been doing, because Marxists, for instance, and Philip Abrams, the sociologist I quoted, he is a Marxist. He considers himself a Marxist, more specifically Maoist sociologist, or at least in '77 when he wrote it, he identified as a Maoist. I don't know about these days. But the limitation of that approach, because it was rooted in Marxism that understood mode of production as something that happens at the place of work alone, rather than the production of people, it ends up giving us just the elements of state formation. And so even though Philip Abrams was sort of one of the first to make this critique, because he approached it from a Marxist understanding of mode of production rather than the Marcel Mauss approach, he ends up much of the historical sociology of the structuralist and post-structuralist variety ends up being just really a portion of this richer history that they're showing is always full of possibilities if we go back and look for the kinds of clues that we should be looking for. It's a huge chapter. I'd love to hear what others thought. Just one final thought. It ends with the coda, where I was already so convinced, and then they get to the coda and they lay on one more example, which in some ways is kind of, I think, the best example, because it's such an exception that archaeologists haven't been, I don't know this literature, but if I take them at their word, archaeologists haven't been able to explain the Minoan case satisfactorily, and yet it existed in an area where there was extreme patriarchy and heroic societies and commercial societies, and yet this one seemed to go a different route. And so it seems to confirm the idea of schismogenesis being really a powerful force of cultural comparison in society that has been underappreciated, because if you think about what creative refusal or schismogenesis requires, it requires a kind of creative refusal, a kind of rejection that is the way people will define themselves against others at the same time that they define themselves with. So it ruptures that binary between insider and outsider, while also maintaining the reality of insider outsider, because these are in many cases decisions that that people see the deep political implications of decisions that historically historians or scholars have not given people the adequate agency in seeing these decisions as political. They've typically been understood as just decisions that people just made because they didn't know any other decision to make. And that is just that's doing a real disservice to our intellectual ancestors, who appear to be much more sophisticated than we've acknowledged. So I'll pause there and love to hear from folks. Feel free to raise your hand with the reaction, or in person, whatever works for you. Simona.
Hi. I totally agree. This is a book on itself, and an important book even. And about appropriation of women's wisdom, so to say. There is an interesting page about, so to say, the abstractification of care, how personal care that is for a unique human being became care for the gods and care for the king. This is the schema of sovereignty, and it's quite interesting because this process of transforming in something abstract, exchangeable, not unique, is the very process of property, of reducing our freedom to property, and of money, and of sovereignty. And I'm reading Debt now, and there David makes a note about Hobbes and the formation of the state, and he says it's only when you strip away the property on one's own, when you conceive human rights and human being as a property, as the body as something you own, the rights something you own, and in Roman law concept of property, that is I have a right to destroy it, and the main meaning of property is that I can use violence to get everybody out of it. So it's an isolated idea of property and of freedom, and it's an idea of freedom that really cancels everything that is concrete in human beings, relationships, values, and creativity, and reduce everything to what can be exchangeable. And on this basis, you can conceive sovereignty as we entrust our rights to a sovereign, to a monarch. And I better understand Spinoza's criticism on Hobbes when he says, no, if your rights, if your natural right is yourself, your being, you cannot alienate yourself. You can alienate yourself and your freedom only when it's commodified, when it's abstracted from real life. And this is the same process that happened with care and with women, and also with conceiving production as just what happens in a firm, because you strip away everything and just leave what's exchangeable, what's neutral, what's non-human in a way. On another side, I was very startled by the beginning of this chapter, because political theory and legal theory are my area of expertise, and we never ever thought of an origin of the state. It's blasphemia in my area, at least, to ask oneself whether ancient Egypt was a state or not. State is not Jean Baudin, it's Machiavelli, the first who used this term, and he, on Machiavelli's basis, the term launched a current in political theory that is that of the raison d'etat, reason of the state. That was a, so to say, materialist approach, a Machiavellian approach to politics. And Machiavelli uses this term just to use the most neutral term he can find. State is just condition. In Italian, it's like state of the art. It's he begins the prince with the words, all the states, the conditions in which human beings have been until now can be republics or monarchies. So he refers just to the self-organization of a group of people, maybe on a territory, but he doesn't mention the land. It's just how does a group of human beings organize. And until Machiavelli, it was never was an issue about state. It was an issue about government, forms of government. How do people self-organize when they live in a group? And this is also the way Spinoza uses the term, even the term imperium, that literally means domination, command. So I was startled because this is not an issue. The origin of the state in Mesopotamia is not an issue in my world. But it makes perfect sense inside their discussion, because actually, even if in political and legal theory, we don't care of looking for the state in ancient Egypt, it is true that when studying history, we frame ancient Egypt as in terms of a state. one last thing, and then I'll be quiet for a while, I promise. They say the state how we conceive it today, that is in Van Heering and Max Weber conceptualization, is a collection of those three features that are sovereignty, bureaucracy, that is information, and charisma. Historically, we find states in Machiavellian meaning that are based on just one of those three principles, or two. They also say somewhere, I cannot find the page now, that usually the three aspects stand together, but one of them is two aspects stand together often, but the third is thrown off. And actually, charisma and competition are opposite to sovereignty, and they don't go along very well together. So it's quite comprehensible that they are drifting apart. They stayed together for a moment, but it's easy to foresee that they will drift apart.
Yeah, I think it's really important to recognize just how intimately connected property is to, well, they say that landed property is a subtle mix of morality and the threat of violence. So these regimes that find property in land, they require this kind of violence in order to maintain the institution of property, because those who property really isn't as much about the ownership of property, though that matters, but it's even more about excluding others from owning it and creating this artificial scarcity, which is why so often this threat of violence can be transformed into a kind of enslavement, because if the way to create one of the most effective ways to create property is to prevent other people from having access to land, and that thereby creates property. And then if you put those people to work, they will then be producing material that can be extracted from the land, which can then form the basis of wealth. So they say it elsewhere, but again, it's a reminder that you can't have these sorts of systems without there being violence, and that when you want to trace the history of the modern state and capitalism, for that matter, you have to go back to landed property, and landed property is the result of enslavement, and so ultimately property is violence, which is theft. So it ends up being a very kind of, an argument that Marxists would I think find very satisfying, but they're doing it in such a sociologically, anthropologically, and archaeologically rich way that they're able to show that it's at the most intimate levels where the relations of care can be transformed into these relations of domination. Because in the example of a slave, an enslaved person owes his or her life to the owner, but also they owe their death, because the enslavement is a form of social death. And so you see right there in that one institution the way that relations of care, I care for you, so I'm going to enslave you, are also relations of domination. I have enslaved you, but I care for you, and I can show that I care for you because I'm actually preventing your death. And so this is better than death, yet it's also death. And, you know, teasing that out and showing how property really, in its first formation, requires this kind of violence, I think should, I hope, warn people or make people be more cautious when they write these kind of Pollyannish histories about the modern state moving us in directions toward increasing social welfare. Because if that social welfare is a form of care, it could also very easily be a form of domination, depending on the way that it plays out. And yet these don't necessarily need to have all of the same origins or play out in the same directions.
Michael?
Yeah, so I don't know if you can hear me. I'm a little surprised that people are talking a lot about the sort of property as the issue, because they do talk about property a little bit in this chapter, because I definitely remember reading that, but it was only one particular formulation, and it's much more related to the modern state and Locke. Although I didn't quite follow everything that Simona was saying, but I did see that she started with the issue of care and domination. That's also where Steve is talking about, and that this is really a chapter about the state rather than about, say, capitalism or about material production or who gets stuff. It's not really about the material wealth. It's about what is the state. And what makes it confusing for me, and it's very charming, is that it starts off with these various definitions of the state. The state is this. Oh, but somebody else, the Marxists, say the state is about expropriation of the property. Here's other people that say the state, that use the idea of the state in another definition. It's whether the state is organized violent, the ability to create violence on a community. All these definitions of state, but by the end of it, it's kind of undermined the idea that of the state at all, because it was never clear to me whether this chapter comes up with this is the definition of a state. It kind of addresses that the state is a big issue, and then here's these various issues and there's various moments where they give examples. Now everyone agrees that such and such a place was a state, so Egypt was a state, or they might have other places where they say it's more or less a state in these ways or whatnot. So do people think that there was a definition of the state in this? Certainly when they come away from it, they're like saying that they have these three principles of different types of things that come together to be a state, but it's not even clear that you need all of them for it to be a state. A bunch of these are just two of these principles, like sovereignty and administration were easily the power to be a state. And in other places, you'd say, well, that's sort of a state. Like the people in Florida, the guy that lives in one hut, and nobody ever goes there, because as soon as they go there, he can tell you to do anything, including, kill you or take all your property. So it's only certain time, so he doesn't have this much and was that a state itself? So at the end, they kind of that the state is really a useful concept. And they say, well, yes, we're talking about the state, and here's this dialogue of the state has emerged over the last 100, 200 years in social science. But if we go back, we have these other things that sort of fit like what you would call a state, but they don't fit the theory of the state that people have been using. And here's these other things that have origins. And so these three principles, as if there was only three origins of the state, I would just throw out that they actually emerge differently in different places. And it's only, Graeber and Wengrow that say, this is charismatic politics and this is charismatic politics. One's happening hundreds of, thousands of years later on a different part of the world. So it's quite possible that they're just finding some similarities between these two things, calling it charismatic politics, and somebody else in the future might separate out different types of charismatic politics. Or, I suppose that's a different, so that was kind of my interest in this. And I don't know how much Marxists in a strictly Marxist kind of framework would enjoy this book, because I think there's a lot of controversy in people reading it, people saying, yes, that's a great book. Oh no, it's not quite right, because it doesn't center property and exploitation, which is taking, Marxism really seems to me to be a theory of exploitation. People are their labor is exploited. And of course, it doesn't emphasize as much domination. So in order to exploit, you require domination. And this Graeber stuff is really a theory of domination, it seems, in many ways, which then also lends to domination. Many people use domination to do exploitation. I don't know how successful you could have if you were just dominating people, but you weren't taking their resources, then your domination might run out of money or resources. So people probably, you might imagine a place that is designed to exploit people so that they can be sustainable in their domination, or a place that only is able to dominate people so that they can get the resources, I suppose. But I do think that the point being that both Steve and Simona were saying about the conflation of care and violence as one of the key points of this text.
Simona?
Oh, thank you. But only if there's nobody who wants to jump in before me. No, okay. Thank you. Michael, first of all, property is everything but material. And it's not so much about Marxism or production. It's that when they start to define the three forms of domination, they start from property. The example is about property of diamonds and how can, I don't remember who, keep her diamonds collier from being stolen by, yes, thank you, Kim Kardashian. How can she parade her diamonds, and why does she parade them? And they say because of violence, because she has guards that prevent people from taking her diamonds, because of information, because she can hide the diamonds and nobody knows the combination of the security. And by charisma, because she persuaded people that she's so exceptional that she should have diamonds. everything is social power is starts from property. There is no real difference. And I quote from page 363. Landed property is not material, is not actual soil, rocks or grass. It's a legal understanding maintained by a subtle mix of morality and the threat of violence. In fact, land ownership illustrates perfectly the logic of what Rudolf von Heering called the state's monopoly of violence within a territory, just within a much smaller territory than nation state. The logic of our logic of freedom is that of Roman law, that is, we are kings in our house. We are we have an absolute power inside the borders of our property, and we have the state has an absolute power within the borders of its territory. It's the same logic as and in the karaoke, this will be my quote. All this might sound a little abstract, but it is a simple description of what happens in reality. As any reader who has ever tried to squat a piece of land, occupy a building, or for that matter, overthrow a government will be keenly aware. Ultimately, everyone knows it all comes down to whether someone will eventually be given orders to remove you by force. And if it does, then everything comes down to whether that someone is actually willing to follow orders. Revolutions are rarely won in open combat. When revolutionaries win, it's usually because the bulk of those sent to crush them refuse to shoot or just go home. As for caring labor and property and abstractification, I referred to page 408. I don't know from where to start. Perhaps this is what a state actually is, a combination of exceptional violence and the creation of a complex social machine, all ostensibly devoted to acts of care and devotion. There is obviously a paradox here. Caring labor is in a way the very opposite of mechanical labor. It is about recognizing and understanding the unique qualities, needs, and peculiarities of the cared for, whether child, adult, animal, or plant, in order to provide what they require to flourish, freedom. Caring labor is distinguished by its particularity. If those institutions we today refer as to states really do have any common features, one must certainly be a tendency to displace this caring impulse onto abstractions. Today, this is usually the nation, however broadly or narrowly defined. Perhaps this is why it's so easy for us to see ancient Egypt as a prototype for the modern states. Here too, popular devotion was diverted on to grand abstractions. In this case, the ruler and the elite dead. This process is what made it possible for the whole arrangement to be imagined simultaneously as a family and as a machine, in which everyone, except of course the king, was ultimately interchangeable.
Yeah, and they return to the same theme where they sort of provide a I don't know, I guess an example. This is on 439, where what Simona just read is about them suggesting how we ought to rethink state formation. And so they return to this idea 30 pages later. The process usually called state formation can in fact mean a bewildering number of things. It can mean a game of honor or chance gone terribly wrong, or the incorrigible growth of a particular ritual for feeding the dead. Or it can mean industrial slaughter, the appropriation by men of female knowledge, or governance by a college of priestesses. The line that really stood out here is the incorrigible growth of a particular ritual for feeding the dead. And I think what they're saying, they're basically drawing a parallel between the ancient states of Egypt with the pharaohs, where people were compelled to create as interchangeable elements of this large social machine. They would create these collective enterprises that were the pyramids that were there to really feed the memories of the dead. And so I think they're making this suggestion that that's really what capitalism is also, is a machine, a great big machine. I mean, Hobbes would certainly suggest this, that it's a great big machine that is dedicated to the production of something outside of ourselves so that it can be expropriated, but that what we're really living for is the production of each other. But that appropriation is then the practice of appropriation is the practice of state formation. And so we are currently living in a system, I think they're saying, where we are dedicating our lives to producing goods to feed dead gods. Yeah. I don't know if others read it that way, but I love these lines where they'll just kind of drop these clever insights where I almost feel like the two of them are kind of smirking when they wrote this, because they know that this is where the logic of their argument is leading, and that one of the big mistakes is in thinking that that states have somehow improved and that we aren't somehow just producing for dead gods. And that if that's the case, it doesn't need to be that way, because obviously our production isn't really sustaining gods, it's only sustaining the myth that there are gods. And so this is not something we need to continue doing if we, as they say, realize that the revolutions happen when the people who are called upon to shoot the ones who were revolting start laying down their guns and stop shooting. So again, it's the return to this idea of creative refusal being the basis of culture, rather than culture merely being the things that we do. It's even more the lines in the sand we draw, the lines where we say we will not go, that define us as humans. And that I find I find it edifying, because rather than, Lenin's famous question, what is to be done? Really flip that around, and it's what isn't to be done. Maybe it's not pursuing a vanguard, not going in particular directions where these relations of care are transformed into relations of domination, which is, of course, what a premise of vanguardism assumes from the start, is that there is this official or secret or privileged knowledge that therefore knows practice better, which is starting the whole cycle down the wrong path. Yeah, I mean, it's just if we start from mutual aid, we're going to our ethnography is going to lead in different directions. That doesn't, I think, exclude stories of conflict and expropriation, but that are really presenting just one side of that coin. And, you know, Graeber's work is always interested in looking at the moment you have one side, there is automatically another side. And that we can hold two sides in our intellect or in our science simultaneously is really sort of the height of intellectual practice, like holding nuance rather than trying to erase nuance. And they end up, you know, as this next chapter, Full Circle, will show us, now that they've made this step to rethinking an approach to history, they're able to return to the indigenous critique to show that European Western ideas of the indigenous critique were really kind of short-sighted because they didn't see some of the points that the indigenous were trying to make to Enlightenment thinkers about this falsehood about social evolution, and that, you know, material production was somehow more advanced than the production of people. When I read it, I feel like entire textbooks need to be rewritten. And, you know, and I'm hoping that happens. Yeah, Christian.
Hi. I'd like to ask a question, and to be honest, I kind of jumped into this meeting without proper preparation, so I'm paraphrasing from memory here, so please don't kill me. But I wonder if the arguments we had just now is where we are getting a little bit drawn into the sexy part, so to speak. Because it doesn't get much more sexy than, you know, you talk about the care of kings and gods and dead people, and, you know, you can make a movie out of this very easily, so to speak. And I think in the beginning of the book they said, like, the original critique of like someone like Conjoined was, look, you Europeans, you're not taking care of each other. That's your big problem. And if we talk, and by the end, this turns into care turning into abuse. And I mean, this all starts on an interpersonal level. I think they had this example of, there were certain societies where someone, for some reason, started to take care of orphans, maybe people that were injured or sick. And this kind of turned into a kind of retinue that he could dominate, she could dominate. And I mean, that's the point where it basically all starts to go wrong. When your relationship of care on an interpersonal level between people that are dependent on you for whatever reason starts to turn into a form of violence. And then it's not only about expropriation of goods, it goes about like expropriation maybe of the spirit itself. I found myself reminded when I read certain passages, which I unfortunately can't quote right now, about like certain stuff I read about, you know, abusive relationships, the way someone would try to start controlling the other person in a relationship and do violence onto those people. And I mean, this basically starts between two people in the household, basically. And all this is basically possible without property, without armies, without feeding the gods. I mean, once we reach the point where we talk about taking care of, you know, gods, kings, and the dead, I mean, things have gone quite a long ways by then. I mean, this is more like does this make sense? I'm kind of wondering.
Yeah, Michael, did you want to, I saw your comment in the chat. It kind of speaks to that. I don't know if you would like to comment.
Yeah, maybe you could just, if you said your question again clearly, because I mean, I didn't know if it, because you asked several and I didn't know if there was one clear question, but I definitely thought that that there's certainly not, I mean, saying that care could be violence is not really what the book is worried about so much, as that violence is used to appropriate care. So so slavery means that and I think this is somewhere as a quote somewhere else in the book rather than this specific chapter, but that slavery is when people are forced to look after the master, the slave owner, and reproduce their life. And so if in that sense that you're appropriating the labor of care, is maybe that is what, and that enables certain people to have a powerful vision, a more power in their life to be fully, well, I think the quotation is to be fully human. Oh, look, somebody's looking after you so you can get up in front and be on the stage, but it also means that their vision of the world is enacted, and part of keeping that vision is then using violence to make sure that they control care of themselves. And I tried to, my union is on strike now because in the UK, there's a national strike on. And so I was trying to argue that it's not just the specific care for the owner, it's that the owner, you're also in the education sector, we have to care for the owner's vision of the world. So that, we're basically, producing care for human beings so that that students can grow up and participate in the world and participate in a caring economy. And much of our employers are saying, not only are we not going to pay them for the caring labor that educators do, we want them to educate and care for people to produce the world that we want, which is teach them to be business people that will, make money or work for employers and think, much more of not a world about people growing up as caring people, citizens of a caring economy, but citizens of a ruthless and exploitive economy, either as laborers or, support for owners. So I don't, that probably doesn't answer your question, but maybe that goes some direction towards it.
Well, to some degree, but what I meant is, what you described, this is like the end product, basically. This is where we ended up. And what I meant by it sounds way more sexy to talk about this way. But if you go back to the beginning, where care starts to be first turned into violence, isn't this more the point where you all this stuff that comes afterwards, the taking care of that and kings and gods, which forces...
When does care get turned into violence?
Straight in the beginning, when you have an abusive relationship. I think this is there were whole passages in there where I thought it
isn't that just violence? Like that.
Sorry?
Isn't that just violence? It's not care.
Have you ever read how someone who's in an abusive relationship, how these people are being manipulated into doing what the other person wants, the forms of psychological violence that are employed there? And this is where it starts. That was with my thought.
Care. It's not, the care doesn't become violence. The violence is used to make another, is used to make. So in the manipulation, one person uses violence or manipulation, some form of power, to make the other person care for them. Maybe not, maybe they don't like them, but in a literal sense, they do the dishes, they make the house, look after the house, they reproduce the life of the person. So that's all I don't, maybe other people don't agree, but I'm just trying to argue that the violence is used to appropriate care rather than care becomes something dysfunctional.
Well, I think and again, this is just my read, but I think one of the reasons why the authors return so much to slavery is because as an institution or a relation, it is in many ways that precise point where care and violence become one, because someone who enslaves someone is socially killing them. You know, Patterson's argument about slavery is social death. But if not for their care, the enslaved person is dead. So care is, again, one side of the other coin. And it's right there where the two fuse, which is, I think, why the authors keep coming back to Rome and to Roman law, because it's the Roman household with the pater familia, which is, you know, also patriarchy and patronage and paternalism. You know, paternalism is kind of one of these where it's care, but it's also it's domination, because it assumes a hierarchy. There isn't necessarily, I guess, violence in that case in a family, but what they talk about is, as a legal construct, the pater familia in ancient Rome, the male of the household did have exclusive rights over the monopoly of violence to mete out that violence over members of the family. And so I think I agree that I found it confusing at parts, because I can't tell if they're trying to kind of link slavery and male dominated patriarchal households, like if they're trying to historically see common origins there, or if it just happens to be that so much of this traces back to Rome, and what we're talking about is a system that today the modern state, you know, is founded in large parts in these legal concepts that trace back to Rome, and so that's where the evidence leads them. But that's why I think there's confusion with, is it care that leads to violence, or is it violence that leads to care? I think it's care that gets constituted as violence, and violence that gets constituted as care, sort of at one and the same time. But that's my way of reconciling it, and I'm not sure if that's the argument that they're trying to make. I don't know if anyone has thoughts. Oh, Simona, yeah. You're muted, Simona.
Okay, here I am. There is a well, a book should be should stand by itself and be understandable by itself. But I think in this case we need to refer to other, at least David Graeber's works. In particular, he wrote an interesting text that is The Bully's Pulpit. And what's fascinating in this text is that the bully, sorry, how should I pronounce it? Bully or bully? Bully. Okay.
Bully.
Bully, thank you. Is affirming an order, a reality. A bully is not just enacting violence. He's enacting a vision of the world, and a social order that he thinks is the right one. And this kind of social order is that of heroic societies, and also making reference to debt. I think there the issue is explained very well, as some patriarchy as something issuing from heroic societies that formed on the fringe of great empires and great civilizations, and that formed as a conscious refusal of whatever this civilization represented. And there is some pages about the veil that for these heroic societies was the symbol of that said that a woman was not for sale. It served to distinguish a woman that belonged to a family, to a patriarch, from a woman that could be sold on the market. And it came from a conscious refusal of sacred prostitution. And who were the women that were in the temples and were prostitutes, sacred prostitutes in Babylonia? It was women who needed protection. It was orphans, widows, and so on. So this structure of power comes out on one side from the honor issue of being able to defend the members of one's family from violence, from being sold on the market. And on the other side, the protection that temples offered that turned out in being on the market. I don't know if I was clear, but I think the connection is there. And also on the other side, and this is in the dawn of everything, the process by which the care for the dead of one's family, the beloved individual ones that were dead, became the care for that king that is became something abstract, something that was not anymore referred to a person that you personally knew and loved, but an higher reality that was the pharaoh. And this kind of care changed of sign by becoming abstract. But there are some very interesting pages about the crew that built the pyramids. And I also noted that the groups that worked, the working groups of pyramids were called philias. That is the Greek term for friendship. And they, in the book, they say it is the term for ancient crew for boats. And also govern is the Greek term for commanding a boat. Do you say drive a boat? I don't know, but for using and directing a boat. So I think there are those three sources, three ways in which care becomes power and violence. Protection of the women, of the family, protection of those entrusted to a temple, and I forgot the third, but I said it just a second, and care for the dead that becomes abstract.
Would anyone like to have the last comment? I noticed that the time. So if anyone would like to provide some final words. Syed? Yeah, go ahead. Oh, are you muted? I'm unable to hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just thinking about these narratives about state and violence in the current backdrop. I'm sitting in Toronto, and we had the Freedom Convoy in Ottawa and the blockades on essentially trade routes with the states and the American border. And like obviously Graeber and Wengro, like Graeber, I don't know how anarchist Wengro is, but like the anarchist sentiment comes forward, and like these passages could be read very much in support of the protests that are happening right now, and how the state then justifies the use of violence to defend capitalist and economic interests of the larger society, which are framed in the sense of care for people who are trying to do their job and support their families. And these protesters are inhibiting that ability for the state and for the businesses and other people who are just trying to go by about their life. Those things are being inhibited by these protesters who are trying to express their agency and resist states' infringement of what they conceive are their freedoms. So it's just interesting to read these passages and have them, obviously the people who are protesting have their reasons, but when I read these passages, it just makes me think that all of this could be very much framed in support of the protesters, and how where we are in society, especially with regards to like COVID restrictions and restrictions on movement and passports and vaccinations. So yeah, I just wanted to share that.
Yeah, I think it's a good point, because that's, that because they are, or at least Graeber is trying to work from a social theory of action rather than presupposing intent, and rather just looking at the behaviors and trying to work from there. Yeah, I do think that these can be seen as creative refusals. I would, however, add that they're creative refusals that I think it's being revealed that they're being funded by a lot of outsiders, a lot of well-funded conservatives in the U.S. who are hoping to disrupt just everything that they can having to do with commerce and politics. But I think this is a good point, that, and it's one that the authors speak to directly, where they say, is it ultimately that all politics comes out, as Mao said, out of the barrel of a gun? And they're tempted to say yes, but they ultimately conclude no. And because I think what they're saying is that the refusal is stronger than the violence. and because they're working from an idea of human nature being neither bad nor good inherently, that there will always be people who will make the sorts of rejections that it's clear from their perspective, you know, which side they're on. But it is, I think, a real reminder that refusal is one of the strongest political weapons that we have. And, you know, for an anarchist like David Graeber, that is aligned with sort of, you know, the anarchism as an ethics of practice, first and foremost, where you should actively be creating the world that you want to create, and by refusing to create the world that you don't want to create. Okay, well, thank you, everyone. I think that's probably good for this go around. I look forward to seeing you again in 2 weeks. We'll do Full Circle, another very lengthy chapter, and you know, we'll do our best to get through that, because they are trying to then lay out a more nuanced critique of the Western world, or what people came to believe as the Western world. And it's the kind of critique that they'll end the book as a pointer to the kind of directions where they think that we should go in terms of rethinking human history. Okay, so I look forward to...
Steve, yeah, can I just say, yeah, we are going to organize a karaoke reading a group around mid-October about, and the theme will be the down of everything. So if you want to get involved, it's it might not be a bad idea to start collecting quotes. And if you have really good quotes for us, you can send them to me or to Steve, and we're going to put everything on a Google Doc. Yeah, so the night will be on the 14th of April, but it might change, so to be confirmed. And for those who are not familiar with the concept, I'm gonna share a link quickly if I can find it. Yeah, sorry about that. Yep, discussion. Okay, that's all. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Thanks, everyone. See you later. Bye.